So our next speaker will touch a topic that we've heard throughout the day, and that relates to the Indigenous peoples and the use of drones. Barrie Shibley will be talking traditional territories, harnessing the power of RPAS for Indigenous communities and infrastructure inspection. Barrie Shibley brings 30 years of experience of working with First Nations and Native American tribes to his position as president of Coy Wolf Technologies and to his partnership with Unmanned Vehicle Applied Dynamics, UVAD, and Stratus Aeronautics. Pardon me. He is a member of the Carry the Nation First Nation and brings, Carry the Kettle First Nation and brings a unique skill set that encompasses both First Nation and corporate perspectives. Previously, Mr. Shibley spent 14 years as a professional equities trader on the floor of the stock exchange, created Canada's first public companies controlled by First Nations, Tathlika Resources and Crucero Resources. He has established Indigenous joint ventures as Vice President and Director, Indigenous Relations at Aramark Remote, as well as Filterbox Water and Environmental, Strad Energy Services, and Clearback Energy Services. Most recently, he managed the Indigenous supply chain at 50+ First Nations at Trans Mountain Corporation. Barrie will be speaking on harnessing the power of RPAS for Indigenous communities and infrastructure inspection. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you guys doing? Everyone's still shaking off that lunch and doing okay? Well, good afternoon. And I just want to start by acknowledging that today we are meeting again in Treaty 7 territory, and we're also adjacent to Treaty number 4. But then it kind of dawned on me that with the reach of this program, and we have conference attendees that are residing in other treaty areas and traditional lands, and I wish to acknowledge them and welcome them as well. People from Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, and all 6 Métis regions. And we welcome you and acknowledge your presence and respect your cultural heritage and your relationship to the land. Acknowledgement is very, very important because it opens up the mind and your heart and your spirit to respectful understanding and communication. And it's really important to me because my community is part of Treaty 4. And our traditional territory is right next door in the Cypress Hills area. And so it's very important to me, and this is, for a lot of my community, this is part of our home. I want to thank you right now for asking me to speak today. I'm truly honored to deliver my message because reconciliation has to start somewhere. And so hello, my name's Barrie Shibley, president of Coy Wolf Technologies. I'm a proud member of Carry the Kettle First Nation in Saskatchewan. We're about 100 kilometers east of Regina. And we are Nakota Sioux. And I also want to say hello. My name was, and at times still is, Vernon Medicine Rope. Indigenous inclusion, and sometimes Indigenous exclusion, has always been a big part of my life. And I often walk between the two different worlds. This is going to get to be a little bit personal about my history, but it is what has really driven my career and my past 30 years. So I was born Vernon Medicine Rope, and as a young child, I was seized from my family. And I was just another child that, was seized and adopted out, just another child who was part of an attempt to strip Indigenous children of their identity and their culture. And I was soon adopted into a family in Calgary, and my name was changed to Barrie Shibley, and that's who you have here today. Caused me some challenges growing up You know, you kind of wonder who you are. But luckily, I was mostly aware of where I came from. Because, you know, what little kid doesn't want to look at a map and say, oh, I was born there? The trick was I was born on a First Nation, and I was kind of, you know, looking in the mirror at my long hair, and which is, you know, well gone. But I used to sit there and I'd take a look at where I was from, and I was trying to always piece together those pieces of my history and my past. And so Indigenous inclusion was essentially born into me. And I share these details not as a criticism of the 60s scoop, but to give you a sense of my history, my motivation, and my personal perspective. Let's see how this works. There we go. So that type of introduction of myself is very common. When I'm in a First Nation or a community for the first time, I'm always asked, who are you? What's your name? Where are you from? Which First Nation do you belong to? Who is your mother? And those questions are really common because when I'm visiting a nation, wherever it is, we quickly find a common ground and an understanding, a mutual understanding of our personal histories. And that's what really begins to open up the communication. And so today, my presentation is going to include a number of these personal stories, experiences, and lessons learned to help you understand Indigenous inclusion, traditional territories, and how that all relates to the RPAS industry. So before I start that, I want to do one thing, and that is I want to thank David Burkett, the president and CEO of UVAD and Stratus Aeronautics. And Dave has been a great friend for about 30 years, and it was on his insistence that brought me to the shop in Burnaby. And to be able to sit down and envision starting Coy Wolf as an Indigenous-owned company. And he embraced the idea of Indigenous inclusion, and he's provided corporate support, operational expertise, state-of-the-art engineering, and an incredible team and a talent pool that I wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. And together with Dave, we've built a corporate model of inclusion that unites and aligns with First Nation interests. So the drone industry right now is sort of at the very start of looking at Indigenous relation and inclusion. And compared to other companies, I've consulted to many of them, to many First Nations as well. But compared to other companies, the RPAS industry is back about 10 or 15 years. It's a new industry though, and it is something that has been a very personal journey for me, particularly over the last 30 years. And so to take a look back in the 1980s and 1990s when we started looking at the motivation of all this, I was a trader on the floor of the stock exchange. I was trading over 1,000 different companies. I was running around the trading floor every day, yelling and screaming, throwing paper, buying and selling stock, and it was a really exciting career for about 14 or 15 years. I was trading many stocks that were representing startup companies. And I knew that I was the only Indigenous person there. And so I did what I felt that I had to do, and I started bringing in people from the Canadian Aboriginal Business Association, their membership, and brought them onto the exchange floor to be able to experience the action. I also took about 4 or 5 chiefs from Western Canada and flew them to Toronto and to meet the executive of the Toronto Stock Exchange, to visit the floor, to meet the traders and the executives, and to plant the idea that there are other ways of financing projects in First Nations and Indigenous communities. But one of the things that was a real motivator way back was in the early 1990s. And I was at an oil and gas golf tournament. I was standing there on the first tee, waiting to get introduced to the other three guys that I had to golf with that afternoon from a couple of the oil and gas companies in town. And I had on my golf bag a golf bag tag that said, Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. Met the gentleman, they took a look at the tag on my golf bag, and they just started to laugh. They thought that was the funniest thing that they'd ever seen. Aboriginal business. Why? Why would we want you Indians in business? And so I took that personal, played the round of golf, missed a couple of key putts, a little passive aggressive, but I got through the day. But it was always something that stuck in my head. And another experience that happened to me was I was working for a major resource company, and one of the senior management executive of the company came to me and started to share a number of very racist comments to Barrie Shibley about the Indigenous communities that we were working with and the people and such. And I could have turned around and I could have gone to human resources and made a complaint, but I thought, well, why would I do that? So what I did was I waited, listened to him, and a couple of days later I made sure that he was required at one of the First Nation meetings that we had. So we headed off to this particular First Nation. The whole community had shown up for an evening, and he was treated with respect when he walked in. And he was treated with respect as an elder. And he was sat down, and the youth in the community brought him his dinner and sat it down in front of him. And then the council members took him to a council chamber and showed him artifacts, historical artifacts, cultural artifacts that were dear to that community. Talked to him about the protocols in the community. And then he sat down, and little kids were running around playing with him, tugging at his leg, calling him grandpa. And I looked over at him, and I could just tell that he was completely conflicted. This wasn't what he expected to see. So, Chief got up, made a speech, and he turned to our company, and it was a very proudful moment for me. He said he was really happy that they had hired Barrie Shibley, Vernon Medicine Rope, in the company because of my reputation with the communities. I'll never forget the look on that man's face. He turned to me, he had no idea I was Indigenous, didn't know my connection with the community. And he later apologized to me privately. And he said that he didn't realize how his own prejudices were so wrong and how ashamed he was about it, but that it was a life lesson that he was now going to work on building his understanding on. And again, reconciliation has to start someplace. So at this mostly early stage of the RPAS industry, you might be wondering whether or not Indigenous inclusion is worthwhile. I used to ask myself that question a lot as well, particularly when I was at Trans Mountain. One afternoon, I was sitting there kind of taking a look at one of the reports I had to put together, and it dealt with the economic impact. And I sat there and I realized that I had over $1.5 billion of contracts on my desk. And I realized this is where I want to be. I want to be part of this economy. I want to be able to bring this type of impact to those communities and continue on from there. And so, to tell you the truth, I never thought that I'd actually see this day. From the time that I was laughed at to today, where there's a vibrant Indigenous economic development environment, First Nations that are out there purchasing interest in resource projects, pipelines, infrastructure. And they're doing this on 634 First Nations in this country. And those 634 First Nations reside on 3,394 reserves. And all of this is matched with the most exciting new technology to meet the needs of these projects. And this is, again, it shows that reconciliation has to start someplace. So a quick company overview. Coy Wolf is Indigenous-owned company, over 51%. We're proudly working inclusively with Indigenous nations, and that is our policy. Any First Nation that wants to deal with us, wants to become part of the company, we welcome to the table. And this is all because, as you read on the bottom half of the slide, the Canadian government is working to enhance its approach to Indigenous consultation and better integrate Indigenous peoples into the pipeline planning and development process. Efforts to advance the objective include working with industry and key federal and provincial agencies and other partners to enhance Indigenous engagement on project planning, development, monitoring, incident response, general pipeline, and environmental safety, and that is from a statement put out by NRCan. And if that doesn't want you to be involved in the RPAS industry and environmental monitoring, I don't know what else to tell you. If you take a look at the top right-hand corner of the slide, that is their first Indigenous student who was employed with us for about 1 year. He is a Gitxsan member who is a student at UVic in the IT program, and we are very, very proud to have him as part of our team. So this photograph here was taken, if you remember back a little while, that southern portion of British Columbia had some severe flooding followed by an incredible amount of snowfall. Bridges, highways were washed out. We were one of the very few groups that were allowed up into that territory, and that was at the request of the First Nations in the area. And they really wanted us to be up there to take a look at a number of the culturally significant sites and to make sure that they were all intact. And so the work that we do on environmental monitoring is to ensure that First Nations are included in the training, the employment, and future opportunities. We want to create a baseline of data and monitor infrastructure projects for environmental, safety, or infrastructure changes, monitor and document right-of-ways for potential wildlife use and various wildlife patterns over time, monitor and document the effects of projects and incidents on sensitive, culturally significant areas to ensure the security of the lands, provide environmental updates to our Indigenous shareholders and Indigenous communities, and to document the infrastructure projects through historical records and visual representations. And all this provides a baseline for the First Nations to measure the cumulative effects of the projects in their territories. Our First Nations are much larger than the defined reserve boundaries that you may see. And the impacts of industry are often felt hundreds, if not 1,000 kilometers away from the actual project. So I'm going to try to pick up the pace here because I'm running out of time. But my personal advice and some lessons learned, Coy Wolf is really the most recent project that I've focused on around Indigenous inclusion. The concept actually started back on the floor of the stock exchange when I was asked by a number of chiefs in Canada on how we could finance resource development. And so what I did was, I flew them to Toronto, I took them around to the exchanges, meeting corporate finance groups, things of that like. And we put together the very first company that was controlled by First Nations at that time. They spent $100,000 each buying seed capital at 10 cents a share that they were later selling at $9 a share, and they all put about $8 or $9 million into their pockets by the end of it. But it showed them a different way of financing projects. Really, the other personal advice that I can give you is for people to, when you're looking at Indigenous inclusion, is to educate yourself. Attend some cultural events in your area. Follow some news stories that you normally wouldn't read to understand a different perspective. And my top suggestion is to enroll and complete and get a certificate from a course such as Indigenous Canada through the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. Indigenous Canada is a 12-lesson, massive, open online course from the Faculty of Native Studies, and this will give you a certificate, I believe it's free, to be able to show that you have done the studies and have made the effort to understand the communities a little bit better. But I would suggest, if you are looking at this area, to take it one step further. Motivate your staff. Lead by example. Get that certificate. Be a leader. Create a corporate environment that can embrace the change that comes with reconciliation. And remember that just because your company has a policy doesn't mean that your management and employees are respecting it. Hidden prejudices can severely affect your company's operations and reputation. Because once again, reconciliation has to start somewhere. Make sure that you know the 94 calls to action of truth and reconciliation. And that's a lot. But if we started with call to action number 92, which is a call upon the corporate sector to adopt the UN Declaration of Rights on Indigenous People as a framework towards reconciliation. And this simply means that we commit to meaningful consultation and building respectful relations. We ensure equitable access to jobs, training, and education in the corporate sector and long-term benefits for the community, and we provide education for management and staff regarding the legacy of residential schools, rights, anti-racism, and the 60s scoop. My last bit of advice would be to look for organizations in your area for support. The CCAB, the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, CFAR, the Circle for Aboriginal Relations, and another group that I dealt with quite often was NABA, the Northern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association. And so in closing, I want to thank everyone for the time here today, the chance to share my history, my motivation, my personal perspective, and the chance to begin understanding Indigenous engagement and its role in the RPAS industry, because reconciliation has to start someplace. Thank you.
Thank you. On two levels, thank you for sharing the personal story and the quality of advice that you shared with the group overall. We will be going to Slido to look for questions, and I'm sure there are many. I will just talk a little bit into the space as we wait for the Slido questions to come. I'm fortunate that this institution has embarked on a journey towards truth and reconciliation, and we have a new center, Omoxipita, and it's a very intriguing learning process that I know I've only just begun to understand what we need to do. And respectfully, I appreciate the information that you bring, and I hope we embrace it as a group as the industry proceeds. Looking for questions from Slido or from anybody in the room.
Yeah, okay. I've worked, like I say, we have about 10 or 12 First Nations that are currently shareholders of the company. We sit down with the community first of all, and we have our I always approach the chief first, even though I know that he's going to, or her, are going to send me to their economic development group. But that's the protocol. I never enter a community without them knowing that I'm present, because it's not my nation, it's not my territory. And so I start there. Once I meet the economic development folks, I also like to meet their HR folks and find out who's trained in what areas, just so that I know what the capabilities are in the community. We do not send out, we're very open and direct. We do not send out people into the field who are not properly trained and do not have, we can't. You can't even get onto the site without the proper training and pipeline safety courses and such all in place. But what we do is we make sure that they understand the requirements, and then we help lead the sometimes the students to be taking the proper courses and certifications that they need. I hope that answers part of your question.
Thank you. There is another on Slido, which is access to the free course, the program that you mentioned, and I believe that was the U of A, correct?
That's at U of A. You can find it online, and it is a free course. And I think that for the certification, it's a nominal fee of like $30 or something of that nature.
This is an interesting question. Do you send cultural monitors with your RPAS operations?
What we do is our projects are, sometimes we're working for a contractor or a major project owner, and quite often they will have already supplied somebody in that regard. But we always look to bring in employees from that nation first, because we want to have that local economic impact. And so we do that. We meet with elders. We meet with, that's why you saw us up at the top of the Coquihalla searching for some sites up there. But yeah, we take the lead from the nation. We don't tell them what we're going to do. We ask them what they'd like to see from us.
Thank you. There is another question. What do you think is the best way for companies or individuals to identify other Indigenous-owned businesses?
Oh, there are a number of Indigenous directories and guides. When we are looking at working on projects, for example, we'll be partnered with a nation, or a nation will be a shareholder of our company. We get a list from the nation of all their services, and we go to them first. Again, it is about engaging with the community and making sure they have the first opportunity.
Thank you. And one more I think we have time for. Do you track elk herd movements in your work?
We have been asked to, but we haven't done that yet. And that's just because we've been quite busy on other projects. And one thing that I really like to know about is that we have more and more students coming into the program, getting the training and the certification, and that's going to really help us out in the future.
Well, sir, thank you very much. I think we've exhausted the Slido questions. Thank you for sharing with us this afternoon.
Great, thank you.